Good morning, everybody. One of the things that I've noticed over the last 20 years or so is the increasing importance in our national life of Anzac Day. Every year, it seems, the media is reporting that record numbers of people are attending Anzac services. And I think increasingly for both Pākehā and for Māori New Zealanders, the contribution of our fathers and grandfathers in the various wars in our history have actually left us with a sense of citizenship and nationhood which we're only now starting to appreciate. And I guess we need to reflect on what that legacy and that heritage actually is. One of the things that for my father and for me, Anzac Day was never much. And as a kid, we used to never go to the Anzac services, and I often wondered why. My father enlisted in the Royal New Zealand Navy shortly after his 16th birthday in 1943. And when he was 17, he was serving in the cruisers, the Royal Navy cruisers in the Pacific fighting the Japanese. And as an 18-year-old, he was at the Japanese surrender at Tokyo Bay. And he also had the misfortune to be in part of the occupation force at Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped. And I have to say that had a significant impact on his health later in his life. But for my dad, the war, he never really mentioned the war, I have to say, you know. And for us as kids growing up in the 60s and the 70s, the war, and for those of you perhaps of my age, maybe a little bit younger, maybe a little bit older, the war was still something that was talked about in our households. It was something that was glamorized. We used to read war comics and watch war movies and idolize war heroes. And I used to ask my dad from time to time about what he did in the war, and he'd never tell me. He would joke away about what he didn't do or various things that happened, but he never actually talked about what actually happened when he was in combat. One of the things he did say to me, though, was that it was interesting that after the war, particularly in Germany, when they rounded up all the Nazis, they could only count a couple of hundred of them. That somehow the Nazis had managed to commit dreadful atrocities on millions of people. And yet when they were rounded up to be made to account for their crimes, there was only a few hundred. And he said that the real problem was the fact that the German people allowed it to happen, and that there was a moral lesson there for us all in the way in which the Germans in particular, but others, simply allowed things to happen. And he said to me, and he wasn't someone that gave me great moral guidance, I have to say, but he said there's a lesson for us all in that, insofar as that we should not just stand and watch things happen. We should do what we believe is right, regardless of how unpopular that is. And I actually think that's a huge moral lesson that we should now apply to what I believe is the biggest moral question of today, which is the environment. I personally believe, and I have to say I'm deeply pessimistic, that the future of human civilization on this earth is not necessarily numbered, but that the material standards of living that we have enjoyed will not most likely be available to our grandchildren. We are facing, I believe, unprecedented environmental challenges around climate change, species extinction, water depletion, and peak oil. And yet, we don't seem to have ever been close to developing a set of responses to deal with these issues. Jim Wallace spoke, for example, about the fact that this environmental disaster that we're looking down the barrel of will affect the poorest most. And I think we'll begin to see that even here in Aotearoa, particularly as we are obliged, I think, to look after more and more people from the Pacific who simply have nowhere to live. But I also think that there is a moral question that we're going to have to answer. because I think in the lives of our grandchildren, they will be looking back and saying, what on earth did you people do? What on earth did you do to allow all this profligate waste, this sacrilegiousness, this destruction of God's gift and God's creation? And they might well ask us, when did you know that this stuff was happening? When did you know that you were part of the problem? And what did you do about it? And I guess one of the things that we need to think about is whether or not we can say that we were a hero in the battle against those things, or simply were complicit in it. And I don't think that many of us are heroes. I don't think that many of us see ourselves as heroes, but we can still be brave and courageous. I don't believe my dad was a war hero that I hoped he would be, but I actually think that he was motivated for the right reasons to do what he did, even as a 16 and 17 and 18-year-old, and that he came from a generation of people who did their bit, that they possessed a certain basic decency, which meant that they saw themselves as part of a bigger community and that they had a role to play to contribute to the common good. One of the stories that my father did tell of his war experience, and he told my sister shortly before he died. His role was as an anti-aircraft gunner on one of the cruisers in the Pacific, and he was involved in what they call a friendly fire incident. And for those who, most of you know, friendly fire is nothing but friendly. It's when by mistake you shoot one of your own side down. And I'm not certain what role he played in this, but anyway, his ship shot down a British fighter. And for some reason, they put over the loudspeaker system as a way of trying to stop them shooting this plane down the radio conversation that the bridge was having with the pilot. And they all listened as this man screamed in his cockpit as he crashed into the sea. My dad never told me that story, but he told my sister. I'm not certain why he told my sister and not me. But my sister said that he started to cry when he told that story. 50 years later, he held that story with him and he started to cry. And I guess, I'm not certain whether that was because he regretted what he'd done or simply felt terribly moved by what he had been involved in. But I don't actually think he lived a life of regret for what he'd done, but simply a sadness for what he'd seen. And I guess for all of us, we need to make certain that we can't tell those stories to our grandkids, that we can honestly say we did our bit for the environment, we did our bit to try and save the world, and we did our bit to make the world a better place for our grandkids. So I'll leave you just with those thoughts. Thanks very much.